Hi, everybody. My name is Diego. I am the program manager for file development here with LAMDL. And here in this video, we're going to be talking about what counterplans are and how to answer them as the affirmative. Hopefully, you'll see that in all of the files for the novice division and the rookie one as well, there are debate primers to help you understand what's going on in the files. And it also gives you advice on how to structure your speeches. So, today we're going to be using the primer here to help us understand what a counterplan is. So let's start off with the negative first. So according to this primer on the negative side, counterplans in debate are used to propose a policy against an affirmative team. In situations where both sides agree that there's a problem that must be fixed, it is strategic for the negative to bring up a different policy proposal so they are not forced to defend the status quo. And then counterplans are always paired with disadvantages. So if you haven't watched the disadvantage lecture, go ahead and watch that first. It helps you understand why counterplans are introduced in the first place. Okay, let's get into the 1 and C structure. We'll talk about each part of it, and then we'll start looking at the actual 1 and C shell. So first part is pretty simple, counterplan text. This explains the actual policy of the counterplan and what the position does. What are we doing here? That's all the negatives trying to do with the counterplan text. If we look at the negative side of this file, we see that the counterplan text is the USFG should ratify the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea and apply for an exploration contract through the International Seabed Authority. Sounds good. Cool. That's the counterplan text. Second is solvency. This explains how the counterplan solves the problem that the affirmative is trying to solve for. So if we look over here, immediately the counterplan text is followed by counterplan solvency. So it says right here, ratifying UNCLOS solves the affirmative. It opens access to deep sea mining in non-US areas, increases leadership, and competes with China. So we have reasons why the counterplan solves the impact of the affirmative. Sounds good. Third part is net benefit. So the net benefit is going to be different for most counterplans, and it should be because counterplans are supposed to be unique ways to solve the affirmative. Net benefits are the unique advantages that the counterplan has over the affirmative's plan. So you want to explain how the counterplan is better than the affirmative. You can do this through two ways. First way is internal net benefits. Internal net benefits are advantages that come from the unique process of the counterplan that the affirmative can't access. So essentially, this is you reading reasons why the counterplan is a good idea in and of itself, and reasons why the counterplan has unique advantages that the app doesn't offer. Says right here that the internal net benefit for this UNCLOS counterplan is international law. So it says UNCLOS prevents unilateral mining from outside parties. The AF threatens international law. So we have kind of like a mini dissent happening here with this internal net benefit. We know that the plan prevents or threatens international law, and the counterplan increases it. I predict that we're going to get a card here that says international law is really good for some reason. International cooperation solves extinction. Cool. That's the internal net benefit. It's a reason why the counterplan, it's a unique advantage to the counterplan that the affirmative can't access. Like there's no part of the plan in these file sets that increases international cooperation. All right. So we know that there's an internal net benefit. Is there a external one? Let's look at external. So external net benefits are advantages for the counterplan that come from avoiding bad things the affirmative causes. So the Arctic Council counterplan will use the external net benefit by saying that it avoids these dissets from happening and it still solves the affirmative's advantages, meaning the AF plan is not needed. So this probably means that the UNCLOS counterplan is going to avoid the Chinese soft power disset. As the negative, you can say you have two different types of net benefits. You can go for the international cooperation one, and then you can also say that the Chinese soft power one is an external net benefit as well. You do not have to be confined to just one net benefit. The counterplan can have multiple. Cool. So now that we know that, this entire 1 and C makes more sense now. Unless, you got to read it a little bit more to understand the actual concept behind it, but that's the structure of a counterplan. The block has a bunch of other arguments that either extend the counterplan or answer certain arguments that the affirmative is going to make. But let's look at these 2NC/block tips. So whether this is the 2NC or in the 1NR. The first thing is sufficiency framing. When arguing a counterplan, it is strategic to tell your judge that you do not have to solve 100% of the affirmative in order to win the counterplan is good. You only have to win that the counterplan sufficiently solves the impacts of the affirmative. So at the top of the 2NC, what a lot of debaters will do is say that you should evaluate the counterplan through sufficiency framing. That means what I just said. The counterplan does not have to be held to the highest standard of solving the entire AF. You only need to sufficiently solve the impacts of the affirmative. One thought you might be wondering is what does sufficiently solve mean? Nobody knows. That's up for the negative to define. So that's why it's strategic as the negative for you to say, evaluate the counterplan through sufficiency framing, because then you dictate whatever sufficiently solving the affirmative means. Um, Second tip that I have is how to organize your speech. So, now that you have multiple things to argue as the negative, you might have like going into the block, you might have case, dissad, and the counterplan. You might have three sheets of paper that you have to like balance. Um, what I notice is that the most competitive teams cover counterplan and case in the 2NC and then dedicate the entire one in our speech to a disadvantage. This is because the 2NC can dedicate time establishing that the counterplan is preferable to case and can also break down solvency of the case as well. So the entire 2NC, 8 minutes, is just saying, here's why the counterplan is a good idea and here's why the case sucks. You're comparing both of the policy options. This lets the one in R create 5 minutes of offense because again, this is the most offensive speech in off case in debate. This lets the one in R create 5 minutes of offense and gives the affirmative less time to prepare answers against the most offensive argument in the negative toolkit. Right? In order for you to win a counterplan, you have to win that there's an external net benefit, that there's a disad that the counterplan avoids, that the affirmative causes. In order to prove that this is the case, the negative has to dedicate substantial amounts of time to the disadvantage. This is at the same time a strategic reason for putting the disad in the one and R is because since both teams know that the disad is what the negative team needs in order to win the debate, the later you establish it, the later you extend it, it gives the affirmative less time. If you were to argue the disad in the 2NC, that is an extra, like that is extra time you're giving the affirmative to prepare against the disad for the 1R because they've heard it, like they've heard it already. They don't have to pay as much attention to the 1R. So the strategic, the strategy for most negative teams is 2NC is counterplan in case, 1R is the disad. So that is how to be negative with the counterplan. Let's talk about how to be affirmative. All right. Counterplans in debate can be answered by the affirmative using this acronym called POST. So POST, each one stands for a different argument. Let's break down what POST means. The first one is permutation. The affirmative can argue that the counterplan is not competitive with the affirmative. Permutation just means that both can be done at the same time, and there's no need to pick and choose one or the other. So, for example, a permutation could just be perm do both, have the affirmative increase deep sea mining, and let's ratify unclose. The counterplan is not competitive. It is not mutually exclusive is another word that you're going to hear a lot of the times. Mutually exclusive means that they are separate and they must be treated as separate. Uh, Not competitive is the same thing as saying that the counterplan is not mutually exclusive with the affirmative. Um, all of this rests on the idea that the counterplan competes with the affirmative. There are two types of competition. There are two ways to establish that the counterplan competes with the affirmative. It is the affirmative's job to prove that the affirmative is not functionally or textually competitive. So, what do those two words mean? The file and the counterplan primer inside the counterplan file gives you definitions. Let's go over them right now. The first one is functional competition. Functional competition states that the counterplan should do something different and mutually exclusive with the affirmative. If it doesn't, then it's not functionally competitive. So essentially, it just says the counterplan has to do something that is not the affirmative. We should be able to tell that it's different. Um, the affirmative increases deep sea mining. The UNCLOS counterplan ratifies UNCLOS. They feel functionally competitive, but there's also room for a permutation to happen because, ratifying unclosed could also lead to an increase in deep sea mining. So while the counterplan is functionally different than the affirmative, it could still not be competitive. So it's all about like, a gray area and whether or not like the negative counterplan is actually competitive. A more obvious example is like, let's say the affirmative said increase deep sea mining and the counterplan was like, how about we just like never do it? We ban the ability to do it like forever. That would be functionally competitive, like for sure. But with an unclosed counterplan, like it's there's more gray waters to test, and so it might be functionally competitive, it might not. It is the affirmative's job to prove that the counterplan is not functionally competitive. Second is establishing textual competition. When a counterplan is textually competitive, it just means that the counterplan should not include all of the words of the affirmative's plan text. So all this means is that the counterplan should not result in the actual affirmative's plan. The counterplan should not say like counterplan, ratify UNCLOS and then do the entire plan. That is not textually competitive because it's still doing the entire affirmatives plan. What would be textually competitive is if you, for example, instead of like deep sea mining in the Arctic, instead of the affirmative only increasing deep sea mining in the Arctic, a counterplan that is textually competitive might like take out a part of the Arctic that it does not want to increase deep sea mining in. That would be textually competitive because then it's minimizing the scope of the affirmatives plan text. It becomes textually competitive in that way. Most of the time, counterplans are established using functional competition nowadays, so you won't see textual competition a lot, but it does come up sometimes. And we'll go over that more in the theory lecture that is also posted. Okay, so that's all for the first acronym or for the first letter in the post acronym, which is permutations. You're just trying to prove that the affirmative and the counterplan can coexist. You can do both at the same time. Uh, Second is offense. You can argue that the counterplan is a worse option than the affirmative, or arguments that say the AFS plan is better. So let's take a look at the perm and offensive arguments in the actual 2AC shell. So 2AC shell starts out by saying perm, have the USFG do the plan, and join UNCLOS to receive an exploration contract through the ISA. Cool. So permutation, this is essentially implying that the counterplan is not functionally competitive, that you can do both of them at the same time. Um, these are offensive arguments right here where it says turn UNCLOS facilitates more disagreements. So remember the internal net benefit to UNCLOS according to the negative is that it increases international cooperation. This is a turn and offensive argument that says UNCLOS actually makes things worse. We have more turns arguments, but I'm sure you get the picture. Okay, third type of argument that the affirmative can make against the counterplan is solvency deficits. The counterplan does not solve the affirmative. These can either be analytical, so that just means that you can make them off the top of your head, or you can have carded arguments for why the counterplan does not solve as much as the negative thinks it does. We have cards for this right here in 2AC5. It says the counterplan fails because UNCLOS has not granted any mining permits. So even if we do the counterplan that we should apply for this exploration contract, it wouldn't even grant the permit, is what the affirmative is saying. There's no solvency. Cool. Last part of the 2AC structure is theory. So that's the T part of post. Theory arguments are arguments that there are specific types of counterplans or arguments that debaters argue that should not be allowed in debate. So theory can come in the form of two ways. And again, this will be covered in a different video that you can watch on LAMDL's YouTube page. But there are general theory arguments such as making contradictory arguments bad. So, for example, let's say a team says the economy is good and then econ bad in separate parts of your speech. That is a contradiction that maybe shouldn't be allowed in debate. Like theory arguments are like establishing norms for what debaters can and can't do. So let's say we allow debaters to contradict themselves in every single speech. That makes it really hard for the opponents to debate the other side because if you're debating one thing that the opponent says, they can just contradict themselves and then say something else. It leads to like unfair debates, and it would just like result in skews for like which side is easier to win. And so theory arguments make the argument that we should make sure debate is still fair and that there is an equal chance of winning. Theory arguments just say that there are certain types of norms and arguments in debate that should not be allowed because they make debate unfair. Another example is conditionality. Conditionality says that the negative is either allowed to read like multiple advocacies in one speech or like only read one. So conditionality is saying that it's like you should be able to read the counterplan and then also kick it if you want to. You should be able to condition your advocacy of the counterplan. The affirmative can make arguments that say conditionality is bad. That if you read a counterplan, you should be stuck with it, or you should not be able to read X, like a certain amount of counterplans, because at some point it just becomes unworkable. There's also specific counterplan theory. So, for example, there are counterplans that will say like we should fiat 50 state action. So, like all 50 states agree on like this one counterplan text. Seems pretty utopian, seems pretty unrealistic. The affirmative can make arguments for why 50 state fiat is a bad norm in debate. You can also make arguments for why international fiat is bad. You'll see that all of these theory arguments rest on the idea that some sort of fiat is bad, some sort of letting the negative say these things just immediately happen without question is a bad idea. One example that applies to this UNCLOS counterplan would most likely be international fiat. So, for example, the negative relies on the idea that UNCLOS is just going to say yes to this expiration contract, like that like UNCLOS would just be like, "Yep, here's your expiration contract, US. Go have fun with the deep sea minerals." Um, the affirmative can say international fiat is bad. If the negative is allowed to say, you know, UNCLOS is just going to say yes to like granting these expiration contracts without a card or without evidence saying that UNCLOS will say yes. That allows the negative to literally get up and fiat anything they want in order to make their counterplan work. That would probably be unfair because it opens the floodgates for the negative to say that they can fiat counterplan solvency because that like that's a crucial part of solvency. If the negative can just fiat through that major concern, the affirmative loses a huge portion of arguments against this counterplan, and it makes it really hard to say that the counterplan is a bad idea. That would result in unfair debates where the negative is always like has a leg up and the affirmative is fighting an uphill battle. That would lead to unfair debates. Yada yada yada. All right, everybody. I forgot one thing to mention that is pretty important, so that's my bad about how to answer counterplans, and this is part of making offensive arguments about against the counterplan, and that is a links to the net benefit argument. So on top of saying that the counterplan is a worse option than the app, or arguments that say the app's plan is better, you also have a pretty important argument called links to the net benefit that you should always be making against counterplans when you're affirmative, which is basically just means the counterplan actually causes the disads to happen as well. So remember, the net benefit to a counterplan are things that are exclusive advantages to the counterplan or like disadvantages that the app plan causes but the counterplan avoids. Links to the net benefit argument just means that the counterplan actually causes the disad to happen as well. So let's walk through an example of how this can pop up. So this example says the negative argues that the affirmative increasing deep sea minerals angers China and triggers a China dissent. Some war starts. I don't know. China dissent, whatever. If the counterplan also increases deep sea minerals, then the counterplan also links to the disadvantage, right? Ideally, the negative will always want the counterplan to never link to their own disadvantage, but there are instances where this happens. And so if this happens, you as the affirmative, if you are the affirmative in a round, need to take full advantage of this. You need to make an argument that the negative links to their own disad or the counterplan links to their own disad. That has a pretty important implication. The important implication is that the counterplan 100% sucks and you're forcing the negative to convince the judge that the status quo is more preferable than the affirmative. That means that if the negative does not have good case arguments saying that like the status quo is already solving the affirmative's problem, like let's say the affirmative's impact is climate change. If the negative does not have a bunch of case negative arguments saying that like climate change is already being dealt with now or there's no impact to climate change, that means that they are stuck with a really bad status quo and they no longer have a counterplan to avoid the problems that the affirmative presents. That forces the negative to always say that the status quo is good. There are certain scenarios that the negative can do in this instance. Obviously, the negative can argue that the counterplan does not link to the disads that they read. The negative can also make this argument called judge kick, which is, the affirmative has the burden of proof in the debate, where they have the burden to prove that the affirmative is a good idea and that the resolution is a good thing to follow. That, for example, under this topic, we should explore the Arctic, or we should develop the Arctic. The negative only has the burden of rejoinder. Burden of rejoinder in debate just means that they have the burden to respond to the affirmative and prove that the affirmative is not a desirable action that we should take. Because of this, they are not beholden to an advocacy in the same way the affirmative is, right? The affirmative is forced to defend the plan. The negative is not forced to defend the counterplan by any measure. Yes, the negative can introduce a counterplan, but because the negative has a fundamentally different burden in debates, there's this thing called judge kick that some teams like to use to make sure that they are not stuck with the counterplan. So there are multiple ways you can deal with a counterplan that sucks and actually links to the net benefit as the negative. The first thing you can do is uh, prove that the counterplan does not link to the disad. The second thing you can do is just not go for the counterplan in the 2NR. You can just straight up tell the judge, we're not going for this counterplan. Only evaluate this debate as the disadvantage versus the affirmative. The status quo is more preferable than passing the plan. The third thing that you can do is tell the judge to judge kick the counterplan. So remember, because negative teams have the burden of rejoinder and not the burden of proof, they're not stuck with an advocacy. They're not stuck with the counterplan at all. Because of this fundamental difference in what the burdens are in debate, judge kicking means that the judge kicks the counterplan for you. They get to decide that, let's say the judge decides while making their decision that, the negative could have won the debate if they just hadn't gone for the counterplan, if they had just gone for the disadvantage by themselves. The judge can just be like, I'm gonna kick the counterplan for the negative and then just vote on the disadvantage itself. Without any work from the negative. All the negative has to tell the judge is, I'll judge, like, judge, if you're not feeling the counterplan at all, judge kick it and only evaluate this debate as disad versus case. Um, Me personally, I wouldn't rely on it, because if there's one thing I know is judges are lazy. They want to do the least amount of work possible in a debate. They want a clear-cut road to the ballot. And I would not leave your fate in the hands of the judge. I would make sure that if you're the ones debating, you give the judge a clear route to the ballot. So I wouldn't rely on it, but people practice this trend differently. Some debaters like using judge kick. Other judges just do it. Um, I would just say my best piece of advice is to always make your own decisions and make them clear to the judge so the judge knows exactly what to do. All right. With that being said, hopefully you found this helpful, and good luck in your future debates.